On February 24, 1933, gangsters gunned down Dennis Zeigler here in Chicago. Zeigler died in his son's arms. He leaves behind 11 children and his wife, Edna.
I'm Lissa Morgans, and you're listening to Call Edna. Episode 1, The Murder. Hello and welcome to Call Edna, the podcast series dedicated to solving the murder of Dennis Bruce Zeigler, a labor union official from 1930 Chicago, and he's my great-great-grandfather. Let's go to the night that Bruce was murdered. But before you hear the story of his death from me, let's listen to what my grandmother had to say about it, a person born in 1930 in Chicago.
He was in the early 30s, I believe, a union man, and the unions were getting started. He was a hoisting engineer, they called. That was what he did, but anyway, he belonged to the union, and what was happening is the gangsters in Chicago did in the 30s have gangsters. They were trying to get into the union because there was money. People paid union dues, and there was lots of money. He fought them, and gangsters threatened him several times. Mm-hmm. And then he got police protection. And
that was new. I didn't know about the police protection.
He did. But what happened is either the police were not quite sure. My husband's family thinks the police were paid off, but we're not saying that's a fact.
Yeah.
The police said, we can no longer give you protection. So we got off the bus or streetcar coming home from work, and there was a gangland style. Guys in a car went by with guns, and shot him down.
My grandma's account was pretty accurate, although according to the coroner's report, it was more like a revolver and not so much a Tommy gun, but I digress. On Friday, February 24th, 1933, around 6:20 in the evening, Bruce gets off at the Milwaukee Avenue surface car stop on his way home from work. Surface cars or streetcars are no longer running in Chicago, but at one point, Chicago had the largest system in the world. If you need something to picture in your head, think those cute above-ground trolleys that run around San Francisco. Bruce likely gets off around Milwaukee and Addison Street and heads north towards his home in Old Irving Park. Because it's February, the sun has set and it's dark out. According to the Chicago Tribune's reporting on the murder, Bruce makes it about a block away from his house to 3634 North Trip. It's noted that the streetlights are out, so it's particularly dark outside. And that's when it happens. A gunman jumps out from behind a tree, shoots Bruce from behind, 3 shots to the head, then flees in a waiting car nearby, described as a black sedan, with his companions. The car's motion is noticed and reported. After killing Zeigler, it drove south to Addison Street, then turns west and disappeared. As part of the Tribune article, there's a photo diagram of the murder. It looks a little cartoony to our eyes, but this style was pretty common in the 1930s, and it shows how Zeigler is approached and shot. It pictures a man in between a large tree and a smaller tree or maybe a utility pole, and he's stepping forward and firing shots into Zeigler's head. Zeigler is grasping forward as if he's falling to the ground, and the quintessential 1930s black sedan is in the background ready for the getaway. And you can also see the outline of the porch of the house in Old Irving Park. The family only a block away hears the shots, and various family members run outside. The eldest son, David, who's 23 years old, makes it to Bruce, and Bruce dies in his arms. Sadly, later that year, David dies of a heart attack. It's said that his old heart ailment resurfaced because of the shock of Bruce's murder, and his death notice is posted in the lonely lower right-hand corner of the Chicago Tribune on December 2nd, 1933. According to Edna, Bruce's wife, his time of death is 6:22 p.m. And there's a couple things to note about this contemporaneous newspaper coverage of Bruce's murder. First off, there's not a lot of coverage of this. In the 1920s and 30s in Chicago, as we'll talk more about later, it was really a particularly violent time with prohibition and organized crime that this kind of headline wasn't that big of a story. And also it's clear from this newspaper account that there's clearly an eyewitness to this event. There's so many distinct details that tell me that someone watched this happen. I used to review criminal investigations as a public defender in Alaska and as a law clerk in federal district court, and this is a really big deal. Legally, when you're assessing whether someone can be convicted of a crime, it's important where your evidence comes from. So having an eyewitness is pretty damning evidence, and it looks like we have that here. I mean, someone knows the exact direction the car took after they murdered him, where he stepped out from behind a tree. We have the outline of the exact porch and location as to where he was murdered. But no one's ever arrested. And also, we don't have a name. Whoever the eyewitness is, if they spoke to the press or they spoke to the police, didn't want their name provided. And this is not that surprising given the environment in Chicago at this time, particularly given the fact that Bruce was a local union leader, and this wasn't the first threat he had faced because of his role. So let's learn a bit more about Bruce himself. Bruce was born in 1875 in rural Pennsylvania, in an area called Dry Run, which is actually near Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, where I spent 1 year, my first year in college, before deciding that I hated it. Sorry, Gettysburg. I had no idea I had gone to school so close to where one of my relatives had grown up. As an adult, Bruce moved outside of Pittsburgh, likely to find work as an engineer, or it's possible he was looking for an apprenticeship at that time. I didn't find any evidence of college education in his background, so he was likely an engineer by trade who had trained at some point. And in 1902, he marries Edna George, who was born in Cambria County, Pennsylvania in 1887. I'll let you do the math. But they actually have a really happy marriage with a lot of kids. From 1903 to 1926, Bruce and Edna have 11 children, but they didn't stay in Pennsylvania that whole time. Census records show that the family moved into the city of Pittsburgh in 1910 and then moved shortly thereafter to Chicago. They live in an area in Blaine Place, and then they moved to Tripp Avenue in Chicago's northwest side by 1913. This is the neighborhood that Bruce was living in when the murder took place. And it's not exactly clear why Bruce and Edna move, but it's pretty likely because of Bruce's work. Bruce is a hoisting engineer, and there's a skyscraper construction boom in Chicago in the 1920s and 30s, inspired by the Art Deco movement. And Bruce begins working on these pretty important buildings. I wasn't that familiar with architecture in Chicago, especially during this time period, but once I started digging into Bruce's life, a truly astonishing number of buildings, beautiful buildings, go up in Chicago during this time. So if you'll indulge me as we nerd out over a couple of those now. First, you have the Carbon and Carbide building. It's 37 stories, it's coated in black granite and this green gold, earthy but flashy terracotta. It has this gold pyramid at the top and all these beautiful carved-in designs that are coated in 24-karat gold leaf. There's the Civic Opera building and house, which is a 45-story office building alongside a functional opera space that seats almost 3,300 people. Think The Gilded Age, Season 2, Opera Wars, and you're spot on. They have dazzling light fixtures with these gold ceilings and columns around the perimeter of the interior structure. And then we have the big one, the Chicago Board of Trade. It's 605 feet tall. It's a more neutral building. It has gray Indiana limestone, and at the top is a copper pyramid roof. And this is the stunner. On the top of that is a 31-foot aluminum statue to the Roman goddess of agriculture, Ceres. And this is where Bruce comes in. Family lore says it's possible that Bruce helped place the Ceres statue on the top of the Board of Trade in downtown Chicago. If you live in Chicago or you've visited and seen this structure, you know how imposing this statue is on downtown. And my uncle did say one of the stiffest drinks in town is at the Ceres Cafe if you're looking for a martini. Also during this time, over in Grant Park, we have the Shedd Aquarium go up and Soldier Field. There's another family story that Bruce helped place the flagpoles around Soldier Field. And then there's the Field Museum. Originally the Field Columbian Museum and the Palace of Fine Arts, which was constructed in Jackson Park for the 1894 World's Fair, but the building was not apparently aging so gracefully. So construction began in 1915 in the current Field Museum site near Grant Park. This is where some more family stories come in. The family thinks, and it was also reported in a 1993 Chicago Sun-Times article, that Bruce helped lay the columns all around the Field Museum. If you know what the Field Museum looks like, you know that's a big deal. This building is defined by its columns. The east and west sides are a little more plain, just having columns running throughout. And the north and south facing facades have these big covered entryways. And then to the left and right of those entryways, there are some beautiful Roman and Greek statues, again, with columns surrounding throughout. After reading about its construction and thinking about how one of my relatives helped build this iconic Chicago structure, it brought me a lot of joy. It's this physical, tangible connection between him and our modern time, and particularly given what happens to him on that Friday night in February in 1933. It's almost like he set up his story so that he couldn't be forgotten. He was always going to be remembered in some way or another. And the way in which he's remembered most is for his union work. So when Bruce and Edna moved to Chicago, he joins local number 569, the Hoisting and Portable Engineers Union, and eventually becomes the union secretary. This becomes a defining part of Bruce's personality. He is a huge union supporter, and he believes so much in the rights of workers to unionize and of the working class. As a secretary, it's likely that he helped with records, union correspondence, compliance with contracts, general work supervision, and aided the other executive officers of the union. And unions in Chicago are facing a particularly difficult dilemma at this time: labor racketeers. If you're not familiar with the term racketeer, it's members of organized crime units, think Al Capone in the Chicago unit, and labor unions themselves, who siphon union funds towards themselves and their criminal enterprises, essentially misusing the funds that are meant for union activities for personal gain. And Chicago had a very unique structure going on with labor racketeering, in part because of what had happened in Prohibition. So in the 1920s, Prohibition in Chicago created a really unique opportunity for organized crime. Gangsters like Al Capone and the Chicago unit rose to prominence based on the profits of bootlegging and expanded their business into labor racketeering as the decade went on. Prior to Prohibition, organized crime in the days of Big Jim Colosimo in the 19-teens involved primarily the business of prostitution. But Prohibition provided a larger money-making opportunity, and individuals like Joe Torrio, who took over the Chicago unit, began expanding into bootlegging, and he brought one of his proteges in the unit, a lieutenant, with him. And that's Al Capone. There's a lot more to be said about Torrio and Capone, but for now, I'll just say that Torrio leaves Chicago in the mid-1920s after a violent altercation between him and Capone, and then the unit is his. It is Al Capone's world in Chicago. And as organized crime moves into the 1930s, control of labor unions, labor contracts, and price fixing of certain construction industries becomes of interest to Chicago's gangs because it means money. Bruce is a labor secretary. He likely helped with contracts, bookkeeping, expenses, so he would be an important person if someone was wanting to infiltrate his union to get on your side. And in fact, there is an incident at Bruce's union in 1929. Quoting from the Chicago Tribune the day after reporting on Bruce's death from 1933, subtitle, Blame Union Troubles, and I quote, "At the Union headquarters, 612 West Adams Street, it was said that the killing was undoubtedly designed to remove Zeigler so that the opposing faction in his union circles could get control of his organization. 3 years ago," said the informant there was an effort to combine the Hoisting and Portable Engineers Union with the stationary engineers and put the whole under control of a new group. Ed Davis, the president, and Zeigler refused to let our outfit be sold down the river. They fought in the courts against being discharged on order of the International Union of Steam and Operating Engineers. They won in the courts, and they kept this union separate." End quote. So essentially, likely beginning in 1929, the International Union of Steam and Operating Engineers, known as Local 150, begins trying to amalgamate or take over various other unions in Chicago, and they go one by one. And at this time, they try to take over the union that Zeigler is in. Instead of having the freedom to vote for whoever they wanted, Local 150's president, Edward Moore, tried to force the locals' way into the union by requiring the individuals of Local 569 to vote for the amalgamation, by intimidating them and forcing them to mark their ballots in a certain way. And this disrupts Bruce to his core. And so Bruce and Local 569's president, Ed Davis, put themselves at the forefront of the resistance. Something I immediately noticed, of course, as an attorney, is that the informant mentions an injunction, and a light immediately went off in my head. We need those court records. Whatever happened in 1929 and between the unions appeared to have gone in Zeigler's favor. So the law was on his side. But yet, in 1933, Local 150 does take over Local 569. So what exactly happened? And what did the court say? This choice Bruce makes to put himself at the forefront of the resistance also resonates a lot in this day and age that we live in. It's Bruce's choice to stand up so loudly for his union that leads to his death. And at a point in history where I think many of us are reflecting on how far we would go for our own causes, I'm not sure I could do what Bruce did. I'd like to hope I would, but I think it takes a really special type of person to do this, particularly when someone has 11 children, a wife, and a lot on the line. And it's clear that he's beloved by those he leaves behind. Bruce's death is so impactful for his union, even after the amalgamation, that near the year anniversary of his death, they post a remembrance for him in the Chicago Tribune. It's dated February 26, 1934, and quote, "In memory of our late brother, a martyr, to the cause of the hoisting engineers so brutally murdered by the racketeers February 24, 1933, whose death was never avenged. May the memory of his sacrifice ever be uppermost in our minds," end quote. Knowing that people felt so strongly about one of my family members at this time is remarkable. But it also comes with another reality. And that's the reality that Bruce and Edna and their children lived with because of Bruce's courage and because he put himself out on the line. And that came in the form of death threats. In 1931 and 1932, for a period of about 18 months, there were guards at the Union headquarters on West Adams Street and at Bruce's home. I'll mention that there's some slight factual disputes about the timing of this. There's some Tribune reporting in 1943 that it was 32 months, but the rest of the reporting seems to be consistent in that it's 18. And then there's some more reporting, particularly the Chicago Sun-Times from 1993, that the police detail was withdrawn in February 1933. However, most of the contemporaneous reporting say it's Christmas of 1932. So given the accounts, it seems pretty likely that it was 18 months And then in Christmas 1932, the police guards are withdrawn from both locations, which leads me to think, why were they withdrawn? Reporting at the time said that there was a change in city leadership. Maybe there was a budgeting initiative or something going on at that time. What's not explained is what started this 18-month guard. If it ended in Christmas of 1932, that places us around June of 1931. There's nothing I've come across in my reporting yet that's significant about this June 1931 date. The only thing I can think of that's bigger in Chicago history at this time is that Al Capone is finally facing trial for tax evasion charges. As you know, the story goes, he was never caught for his violent acts, but he is caught and found guilty of tax evasion. Briefly in June of 1931, Capone pleads guilty and then eventually not guilty, and he's eventually convicted by a jury of his peers and sentenced in October of 1931. So before he was incarcerated, did he try to tie up any loose ends? And was Bruce one of them? Was there an incident that I haven't stumbled across that happens in June of 1931? And it's also worth mentioning that Capone is incarcerated when Bruce is actually murdered. But this doesn't exonerate him as a suspect, as his Chicago unit continued to operate, and he was also famous for not being in town at times when larger killings happened. A big example is the 1929 St. Valentine's Day massacre, where various members of Bug Moran's gang, which was a rival gang to Capone, takes a hit. It's these bloody pictures in the newspaper that also spur a lot of hatred and public opinion towards people like Capone. But he's in Florida at the time this massacre takes place. So he may have ordered it, but he wasn't there. I wonder too if that's something we have going on in this case with Bruce as well. Returning to what my grandmother said when she talked about the murder, it's also noteworthy that there's a working theory within the family that the cops were paid off, and that's why they didn't solve the murder. But we also have 18 months of police protection. So why did they expend so many resources trying to protect Bruce and then never solve his murder? It just doesn't quite add up. When I think more about 1931 and prior to that time, I think about the death threats that started to come into the family. Beginning in 1929, Edna reported that about once a week the telephone would ring, and the person calling would tell her that they're going to take her husband for a ride in the morning, which was a colloquialism for, "We're going to kill your husband." She also received threatening phone calls that people were going to kidnap her children, and she received a few more interesting calls as well. Bruce, as a policy in the house, would not pick up the phone so that any intimidators who were calling wouldn't come by the house knowing that Bruce was there. So on one occasion when Edna picks up, business as usual, a man asks her if Bruce is home. She says, "No, he's not." And he replied, "I know he isn't because he's here. I'll let you talk to his girlfriend." And then a woman comes on the line. She tells Edna that she's sitting on Bruce's lap, and it's loud and it sounds like they're drinking and out at a bar. Bruce was in fact upstairs sleeping. And he spent a lot of time at the house, likely because of his safety, but also because he was up to the most home projects you could ever imagine. He wasn't just a hoisting engineer, he was pretty talented at house building in general. And he made endless improvements to the house on weeknights after work and on weekends to this Trip Avenue home. As I mentioned, the family has 11 children, and they don't have a ton of money. So when they buy their house, Bruce starts on a lot of improvements. In a letter from Dodie Zeigler, who's their fourth child, to the then homeowner of Trip Avenue in 1977, she says, and I quote, "If those walls could speak, what stories they would tell," end quote. Bruce turned what was a 6-room cottage in 1913 into a 14-room house. He dug out the basement and walled it in with this white enamel brick. He raised the roof, built a chimney, enlarged all the existing rooms in addition to adding 8 more, did carpentry work. After making a new kitchen, breakfast room, and pantry, he placed built-in drawers, sliding doors, and cabinets, did all of the electrical work in a special way to prevent against fires. As we know, in the late 1800s, we have the Great Chicago Fire, so that was of great importance to homeowners at this time. And he did work outside, installing a grape arbor, a chicken coop, and planting trees all around. And the family has no car, no radio, no TV, just the nickel phone that Edna picks up, which, by the way, if you have any idea what a nickel phone looked like in 1920s and 30s Chicago, please reach out. I'm imagining a payphone, but inside the home, and the Illinois Bell Company would come by and pick up the money. But it doesn't seem like it was that common. So if you have any tips on that, please reach out. But because of the lack of resources, the amount of projects going on at home, and then eventually the threats that come in against the family, this home becomes a fortress to them in some ways. And unfortunately, after Bruce is murdered, the family descends into poverty, and Edna is not able to keep it up. But they did fight for 6 years. From 1933 to 1939, almost every kid got a job, including the young ones, to see if they could keep up the home payments. But eventually they defaulted on their government home loan and lost it in 1939. I imagine this would have been very difficult for a family who had spent so much time so closely in that space, who had lost their father, who had poured his livelihood into making this home great for them. It might have felt like they were losing him all over again as they move into a small apartment in Humboldt Park. And this isn't the only loss that the family feels. As time goes on, the family is disturbed that Bruce's murder, much like the St. Valentine's Day massacre, is never solved. In 1933, Edna works with the police to try and solve the murder. In the contemporaneous reporting at the time of the murder, Edna tells the newspapers that there was a list of men's names that Bruce gave her that if he was ever murdered to give to the police. And she said she did it. But in that reporting, we don't have the names. Finally, a decade after Bruce's murder remains unsolved, Edna gives those names to the paper. In the Chicago Tribune on March 27, 1943, Edna provides the 3 names that her husband gave to her if he was ever murdered: William Maloney, John Lynch, and Lloyd Little. And she also mentioned something pretty interesting, that Bruce had a journal of everything going on with his union troubles, and he kept it in his office on West Adams Street, but it was never recovered, and the police said they never found it as well. So who took Bruce's journal? Who knew about it? And who are these 3 people? And are they related to Al Capone? Join me next time as we discuss In the List.